Welcome, everyone. There are some seats at the front if people at the back are squeezing in, so maybe just guide them down to the front. Well, welcome to the session, and I'm glad you could join us, a full house almost, for the TenU USIT guide, which I quite like to say USIT guide because we need to use it, hopefully, and hopefully by the end of the session we can get some understanding of why we should be potentially using it as a starting point for our negotiations. So I'm Jackie Barnett. I'm the Head of Consulting Services at Oxford University Innovation, but in my previous life I've done commercialization for many, many years, so have a good appreciation of the difficulties of negotiating terms with investors. So I think the guide is a fantastic addition to the arsenal of tools at our disposal. We're going to have quite an open session, so we're having one presentation, a very brief presentation, just for those people who are not familiar enough with the guide to just provide them with some of the background, and then I've got a few prepared questions for our panel, but after that open to the floor, or I'll carry on asking questions if you don't. So we'll finish at about 5 o'clock. I think that's the plan. So please feel free to participate in this. I think the USIT guide is there to use, and obviously TenU would like to see that it's in use, that it's going to be useful for the community. So I'm going to just introduce, but not read their biographies, because you can imagine then we'll use up half the session on that. Anne Lane is CEO of UCLB and TenU President at the moment.
Until the end of the month.
Until the end of the month. Adam Stoughton, who is currently at EVTech, but many of you will also recognise him. He was previously at Oxford University Innovation. Simon Hepworth, who is at Imperial College, Director of Enterprise at Imperial College, and Leslie Miller-Nicholson, who is the Executive Director at MIT. So definitely a worthy panel to actually discuss some of the challenges of getting to the point of producing a guide, some of the sticking points, and what we can do with it now. Over to you, Anne.
Thanks, Jackie. I just noticed actually on the slide, I'm also CEO of Cambridge Enterprise, which is great, because just in case there was some confusion, Diarmaid sadly can't be here with us today.
Shall I move out the way?
No, I think that, yeah, that's fine. Great, thank you. So it's a very short presentation. I know it's the afternoon, so I don't want to take up too much of your time, but we thought it was important to talk about why we put together the USIT guide in the first place, and why we think it's important. And it is the first time that the UK universities have got together with the investor community to try and find a landing zone, and I think that's quite an important phrase, and also that it's a guide. So these are not rules, this is a guide, and it's a starting point. And I think that's how it should be used. And really the idea was just to try and facilitate faster negotiations and a more efficient and effective process. These were the people that were involved. Obviously the UK members of TenU, so the 6 universities. Then we had contributions from the VC community, and I've sat across the table from several of the people on that group. And the law firms are also quite important to have involved in that group, because if you've had a chance to look at the USIT guide, and if you haven't, we've got piles of them, so please do take one with you. It's actually quite granular, and it goes into quite a lot of detail, because some of the legal clauses were big sticking points, I think, in doing spin-out negotiation, and so we felt that was quite important. And all of us have worked with these law firms, so they know what the story is on both sides of the table. So we had a really wide group, and we also consulted with founders. So we also talked to academics as well at our institutions to get their input, because I think that was a key contribution as well. Collectively, between the 6, we've had 376 spin-outs. They've raised 8.6 billion in the last period, and that's not just to give ourselves a big pat on the back. That is really to say that we've done lots of these types of deals, so we have a lot of experience in it, and that's the point of that, really, is to say that we've done this, we know what some of the pitfalls are, And I think for universities where they don't have access to that kind of deal flow, sometimes if you're not doing these deals very often, it's hard to know what good practice is. I think it's also important for your, I know from experience, senior management will always want to know what you're doing in terms of spin-out deals. And I think it's good to be able to give reasons why you are behaving and processing spin-outs in the way that you do. So the way the process worked was there were thousands of hours of engagement. We went into a lot of detail. We had 5 roundtable sessions to begin with, 6 what we call deep dive sessions. That was actually going into the detail of legal clauses for spin-outs and licenses to those spin-outs. And then we had full consultation meetings with Praxis Oral, with the BIA, the Bioindustry Association, the British Venture Capital Association, the Russell Group, and we're still talking to groups as well. So, you know, the plan is that we will keep inputting into the guide. So who is it for? It's for universities, obviously. It's for academics and researchers who might not have done this either, because I think sometimes some of the issues that arise come from their perceptions of what they should be getting, what other people get, and actually what's realistic in the market. But it's as much for investors who might not have done many deals with universities, and I think that's another factor as to why universities get a lot of criticism, because sometimes it's the investors that are difficult to deal with and take a long time. And I think there are also factors where you're dealing with charities that might have funded research that can also slow the process up too, and I don't think that's been immediately apparent, certainly not to government. So the landing zone, equity range 10 to 25%, that's a landing zone. There will be some deals where the equity range is lower than that and some where it's higher, and sometimes considerably higher than that, but for good reason. Royalty levels 0 to 5%, it says there it's depending on technology readiness, it's also depending on the type of technology. So again, that is just a guide. And then it's not been oversimplified. So we've put in a lot of detail into this, and there are a number of deal levers, and I'm not going to go through them all, but there's a number of ways that you can change the deal, things like non-dilutive equity, milestone payments, that type of thing, that give you some flexibility around the approach that you take and the deal that you end up with. And other recommendations, really, it's an impact-first approach. So I think we're all here to provide the greatest impact we can for our institutions. Secondly, really you want a back-weighted deal. If you're setting up a spin-out, you don't want to set them up to fail. You want to make sure that they're in a position to pay you when they can pay you. So, you know, you can backload your royalties and milestone payments. That's not the case when you're doing a license with a big company and it's not part of a spin-out, so that shouldn't be confused. And then long-term success, obviously on both parts. If the company fails, then nobody wins from that process. So those really were the main recommendations from putting the guide together. And what do we hope this is going to deliver? Well, we're hoping it means there'll be more spin-outs from universities, that there'll be faster deals with less friction, because a bad-tempered negotiation leads to a bad-tempered relationship. It was certainly my experience. You know, that you can get scale of this now so that investors will come to universities more than they're currently doing, and that it will also attract international investment. So some of you might have heard about ARM, for instance, listing on NASDAQ. I mean, that's one example of where are UK investors in this, and the UK stock market, that needs to be looked at as well. And then just locking the innovation potential of our university system. And I should say unlocking further, because we know that we are getting innovation out there and we're making an impact, but we're hoping that this means that we can do that much more. So in conclusion, it's a unique collaboration. It took inspiration actually from the US. So it's unique in the UK, but in the US they've already done something similar called US Vault. That was the inspiration for us doing that. And Leslie Miller-Nicholson is here from MIT, and she was involved in that process too. And ours is, I think, has gone into much more detail actually than the US one, for good reasons. And we're hoping that that does support a transformational period for the UK. And we'd really like it to be a more successful collaboration between investors and universities. And that's really what we're seeking to achieve. So thank you very much for listening. And back to you, Jackie. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to start with a question to Anne, and I'm sorry, it's probably it's a question which would be on my lips if I was in a university that was maybe taking 35% equity, because equity is always the thing. What do you recommend people say to the academics if they get hold of the guide and say, why isn't it 25% or 15%? To the senior management of the universities, how would a smaller university with a different equity position look at that?
That's a really difficult question, but it's a good question. I think, we do that at UCL. We will sometimes have higher equity stakes, and usually there's a good reason for it. I think if you're going into a discussion with an academic and you know that they are going to ask you those questions, then I think you need to be prepared for justifying why you have taken that equity. And it could well be that you're not taking a license you're not putting a license into the Spinout company, that it is just equity. It could be before you put your option pool in for management and employees. There's a whole number of reasons why you might be justified. You might also have a very expensive patent portfolio in the background that you've been supporting, and you want to make sure that you get a return at some point in the future that justifies you taking that risk. We've got one at the moment. It's around 600,000 already in patent costs. So there's all sorts of reasons why you might be taking that 35% equity, and I think it's important to just make sure that you've got a reasoned outline as to why you've done that. But, I mean, that's by no means an outlier. I've heard of much, much higher equity stakes.
Thank you. I'm going to move on to Simon. Just in terms of the process of developing the guide, I mean, were there specific sticking points, and were there points that you thought, oh, well, that was easier than I thought during the process, particularly with the investors and the lawyers?
Yeah, so I'll start with a specific one. So through the process, we found that at Imperial, we were actually uncompetitive versus the rest of the sector in reservation of rights, which was just thinking about to what extent can a university reserve its right to continue doing activities. And everybody reserves the rights around research and teaching, that's fine, but we were reserving rights beyond that. That wasn't the case amongst our peers, so it was actually a useful learning exercise for us that's actually forced us to go back and change our policies now so that we are coming into line with that landing zone across the 23 parameters that are within USIT. So that was one area. A lot of it went surprisingly well. So we got together, the first round table, actually, Anne chaired that one. We had no, it's a lot of, you could sense the fear in the room. We had no idea how this was going to work. So the real, I think, amazing thing about US Bolt was that it was, for the first time, getting investors and the universities to work together on a common standard. And that seemed to me just like an amazing innovation in that it then removes the arguments from one side saying you're not fair, because then we can point to something where actually the actors from both sides have reached agreement on a landing zone. Some of the difficult things, whether we should have numbers in there or not. So that was a long debate over several of the round tables. And at one point we had more numbers in them than what we have now. So we had actually quite a level of detail around royalties that in the end we decided to take out. And part of the reason for that is to just head off a little bit of cherry picking. So we want people to look at the landing zone holistically. So there are 23 aspects to it. Equity is just one aspect of it. And it's got to be in the balance across those 23 areas. There was nervousness from the investors as well around the numbers. So putting in numbers also takes away some of their ability to negotiate and apply pressure. So I think we reached a point where we knew there was some discomfort with the investors and some discomfort with the universities. So we'd actually achieved some progress there.
As long as both parties are slightly uncomfortable, but not too uncomfortable. Thank you. Leslie, we heard from Anne that the USIT Guide was inspired by, obviously, a similar US initiative, which obviously, I'm presuming you participated in. I mean, tell us more about it. How's it been received? Because it's obviously slightly earlier than the USIT Guide.
So first, the confession. I'm really an imposter here because it was one of my head of licensing who participated, but everybody else from the US went home yesterday, so you got me. But I do know about it, and yes, we were fully involved. So, first things first, very much what has been said here, the purpose of it was exactly the same, and I will say huge applause for all of you that were involved in this, because the level of detail that is provided in the USIT guide now makes it an astonishing training manual. I mean, from soup to nuts, not just deal negotiation, but understanding licensing agreements. The BOLT agreement, as it's called in the US, doesn't go into quite as much detail, and it's much more of a term sheet. But we went through the same pain from the perspective of discomfort, getting people together. Obviously, some people didn't sign off on it, and if you go on the Autumn website, you will see a downloadable PDF term sheet, Word document that you can use. And universities have kind of signed off as participating in or endorsing it and seeing it as a good practice. But there are some people that are not very happy with it because it doesn't align with their approach, whether the numbers are too high or too low or too something. But that's not the point. The point is so much greater than that. And over the last couple of days, we've been in discussions with a number of people to do with the Spinout review here in the UK. And one of the comments that keeps coming up is about information asymmetry. And when you have information asymmetry, even the optics of it, people get scared. What are you holding back? What do we not have? What do you have that I don't have? And these documents provide an astonishing amount of information that should lower the temperature in any room when you come to have a negotiation. In terms of impact, it's really too early to say. I mean, we've rolled it out just last year. One hopes that lots of people are going to use it. I think I've heard the NIH is using the US BOLT guide as a training tool for its scientists. Wilson Sonsini, which is a large law firm in the US, is using it as a training guide for its first-year associates. I mean, what better can we do than put out information that has had such significant input and is not, I think, a document that is going to stand as a moment in time and not be changed and updated. And I'm sure over the course of the next year or so, there will be some updates made, changes made, or reflection on different areas, fields of use, different sort of license types. The focus in the US was very heavily on life sciences, and we've got lots of areas that we'd like to look at.
Thank you. I mean, coming back to the training, it's interesting. I recently gave the Praxis New Venture Creation 1 course, and sort of the end conclusion was read the USIT guide. It's a bit more to creating a spin-out than that, but it's certainly a really good tool if it's the first time you're doing a spin-out and you don't even know what the words mean. So it's really fantastic from that point of view. Adam, you're sort of a little unusual in this lineup, but being both an investor and a company. So, I mean, you haven't contributed to the guide, but what were your initial reactions to it? What do you think about the guide, and do you think it's a good idea for the sector?
So, yeah, I'm, I guess, here today wearing my company investor hat, but I spent many years within Oxford on the tech transfer side, negotiating first-hand company formation, and latterly usually getting dragged into company formation negotiations where there are real sticking points, so specialising in all the real painful aspects of this process. So I was delighted to see that the UK was replicating the BOLT guide in the US, because until now we have not had any reference guide that is a clear consensus built between universities and investors. So it is absolutely unique in the UK context as a reference point. And I think, we're all shaped by our own individual experiences, both as people and as institutions or companies we work for. And that can lead to practices, policies which represent those experiences. And they're not necessarily representative of what is market normal. And so being able to refer to something like the USIT guide, it gives a real sense as to what is market normal. Now, there will be outliers. There will be good reasons in some cases to differ from the terms therein. But it gives a sense as to what should be expected as normal parameters. So, for me, it is quite transformational for the sector. In terms of wearing my industry investor hat, It's brilliant because it helps me at Evotech manage expectations when we're putting together partnerships between both, or with both university partners and our co-investors that include classic VCs, big pharma, family offices. So it allows us to align expectations very early on in the process. So from my perspective, brilliant.
Thank you. I think the question that brought us here today together is how can we optimise the impact of the USIT guide? And I'm going to open a question to the floor in a few minutes, but maybe just from each of you, just answer that, how do you think we can optimise the impact of the guide? Any thoughts on that?
If I can go first from holding the mic. I mean, I'd love to see this guide on the desk of every Pro-Vice-Chancellor for enterprise innovation in the country. Because, yeah, I mean, this is brilliant for those working in TTOs, it's great for investors, but actually it's super important internally in universities to help guide policy and sensible policy, because, very often those in those very senior positions, they've not gone through firsthand the experience of forming a new company. They're reliant on those in the office. Hopefully they listen to them, those that actually have the experience. But again, just having this as a reference point, as they're thinking about how they optimise this activity within their institutions, again, it's invaluable. So I would make it mandated reading for every Pro-Vice-Chancellor for enterprise innovation in the country, if I had that power.
Yeah, I mean, and on the same thread, I think I'd like to see it on investors' desks as well, and it would be really nice if when you went into negotiation, they had a copy of it with them too. And it would be nice to see the government, whichever shape or form it is in the next year, having that as well. So, the relevant minister, it'd be great if they had it too. And the last thing I'd say, I don't want to steal anybody else's answers, because it's always worse going at the end when you ask one question like that, is I think it's really good for all of you, and all of our colleagues in TTOs across the country to let us know about things that they think we should add or things that they really think could be a problem, because we really need to make sure it's a living document.
We've just ordered 250 hard copies for our people at Imperial. So I think an obvious way to use it is just to get more hard copies into the system. We've also had the first instance of it being used against us this week by a founder and an investor actually cherry-picking one of the terms and saying, well, yeah, I like everything else about the deal, but this particular item I've read and use it, and I want it to be different. So, however, we're still enabling a more intelligent conversation around a clear baseline. And per Leslie's point, it's then a far less emotional, far more evidence-based. So, yeah, I think just getting the document out there and read across the community, whether it's founders, investors, university practitioners, university leaders. Just coming back to the investor community, we worked with the British Venture Capital Association during the development of this, and there was a consultation with investors in the room. So again, it's just pointing to that multi-party approach to this development. So it's already out there and respected in the investor community too.
Everything they said. No, I think this idea of it being a living document, I mean, it's in the moment, we're all going to take it and use it, but I think the value in it is going to be the case studies coming out of showing what's worked, and then also those cases that are the outliers, and taking that information to be able to inform the explanations of why something is lower or higher or something in between. And then the other thing is kind of not to burden people with more work, but really looking forward is where else and how else can this principle of collaboration between all of these various stakeholders be useful? What are the kind of compelling areas where we don't have enough data about the commercialization of this particular IP? Let's just throw AI out there and add it to clean tech or healthcare. And, is there a way to utilize this as a foundational block to then begin to kind of build other tools that you can add to this toolkit?
Thank you.
Can I just say one last thing? Thanks, because Leslie alluded to it for the US process, but I think, and I know some people are in this room, that actually the directors of the offices did some of this work, but most of it was done by our heads of licensing, or because it's life science focused, and I can see Rick in the room too, they did a lot of the hard pull for all of us. So I think they should get a real vote of thanks for doing all that hard work.
Yes, that's very good. Well done. Have we got any questions from the floor? And I'm not sure if we've got a roving mic or you can just stand and shout. Oh, we have a roving mic. Any questions from the floor? Right. Just speak very loudly.
It's all right again. Hi, everyone. Rick Fagan, UCL Business. One of the things I just want to emphasize, so I worked with my esteemed colleague Ian, Stephanie Morris, and Simon Warner from OUI on helping to put this together, the detail. But you've really got to look, when asking about outliers and say a 35% equity, you got to look at the deal in the whole, because you might be getting 35% equity, but your licensing terms might be very different to what they had. So, one of the things that I know that we do is an NPV calculation, looking at the deal in a whole. There are trade-offs everywhere. But the one thing I did want to ask, do you think this will have an impact on the government spin-out review? Because we all know that they've got very erroneous ideas about all the equity we take and how greedy we all are. Thank you.
So I think, yes, so we met with Irene and Andrew, who are leading the review, as TenU on Monday. So we are putting forward the views of the community there. One of Andrew's opening remarks was that if we had used it 2 years ago, we may not have been in a review situation at all. So perhaps we came together a little bit too late to give confidence to the government that we didn't need a review. And that maybe gives some sense for how useful it could be. I don't know, Anne, if you wanted to add.
That's what I was going to say.
Okay.
Other questions? Andrew.
So a question for Leslie. What does the UK spin-out system look like from across the Atlantic? Are there things that you think are going particularly well and you might even want to borrow from us?
That is such a great point. And the immediate answer is, from the US side, it looks a lot better than the UK government seems to think it looks. And we told them that on Monday. The amount of investment for the level of research going in and the quality of startups coming out is actually astounding. And yes, it's so funny. I'm here because there's always apparently a desire to talk to those folks across the pond. And so comes the Scot telling them about what's going on in Cambridge. Worked that one out, but the Scots did build the modern world, so there you have it. Yeah, you are all doing an astonishing job. And we, and certainly those with an abundance of riches, kind of get a little too lazy sometimes, but we have to look at some of the really innovative. We visited Northern Gritstone the other day. The collaboration between parties, the different investors and the like, and stakeholders is essential. And sometimes I think we are, we risk not keeping up with all of you by not looking at some of these opportunities. So I applaud you all.
Thank you.
Can I just add one thing to that?
Please.
So one thing we learned yesterday while just discussing the comparison at Manchester was that typically within our spin-out numbers in UK universities, we do not count PhD-led businesses in that number, whereas our US colleagues do. So actually all of the government figures at the moment that are describing UK university performance, the comparison is unfair in that we are missing a whole load of data points from the UK data that would actually make us look even more impressive compared to our US counterparts. So it's good to talk basically and to have the comparisons.
Thanks. I mean, I've got a question on, are there things in the guide that are still open to debate, like still sticking points you didn't quite get round, that you think maybe in a future version of the guide, or maybe it's just always going to be case-by-case basis?
That's a good question. I did get my nightmare question at a panel on Monday evening from someone who asked me about clause 3, subclause 3.2, which is why I've got the guide here, just in case any of you ask me something like that. But it was actually someone from the Alliance for Access to Medicines, and we have put in a section on that because I think it's really important that we do look at that, especially for some of, for instance, we have a gene therapy and we know that that's going to be a very expensive dosing cost. And we have thought about it, but I think that's something that we need to develop because actually it's really hard to get those sorts of clauses into licenses and into spin-out agreements. I can see Ian smiling at me from the centre of the room because I know it, because it is so difficult. I think we've only managed to ever get something like that into, well, Rick will tell me if I'm wrong, 1 licence ever. Is that right, Rick? Can you tell me 2?
You start out trying to get the best. It more often than not, it gets watered down.
Exactly.
Especially in the sort of gene therapy area where we have quite a few. When you're licensing to the likes of to a commercial company, they're like, how can we supply this to middle and low income? We can't be forced to because it is so expensive. So you end up with wording, but Anne's correct. Maybe 1 or 2 licenses. We've got the real hardcore. You must do this or we walk in.
I mean, just on that point, and from personal experience of having spun out companies in the vaccine space, and particularly with tuberculosis, with a major focus on emerging economies, I mean, it is super hard to get commercial investors to sign up to hard obligations to do this because there's too much risk for them. I think often the point of leverage is where there's significant non-dilutive funding from the likes of Gates, Wellcome Trust, and one can use that to at least get towards what the university would ideally want in terms of a serious commitment from the new company to make these medicinal products available broadly in low-income countries. So it's not impossible. But it is difficult, and in terms of what's in USIT, I think it's a fairly pragmatic stance in that one shouldn't go into these negotiations expecting an investor to make absolute commitments to this because it's simply not realistic.
Thanks. Any other questions from the floor? Ian.
Thank you. I mean, I think that USIT Guide is absolutely super and it's fantastic, but I wonder whether it's a significant distraction, which is, many people have observed that the UK and Europe is brilliant at spin-outs, and Leslie points out that it seems very different from across the Atlantic. But what we don't have is necessarily Genentech, Intel, Apple, Netflix, and I could go on. Gluing themselves here. And I wonder if this is as a result, but we've kept a heated debate around this, and we've all been at the back end of that. But I wonder if that's made us take our eyes off maybe a bigger question about how do we ensure that the companies we put down have a better chance of growing, sticking, and generating real economic impact, maybe closer to where they were formed. ARM is just listed on NASDAQ. I'm not sure that's always terribly helpful. Solexa, which is the big sequencing company, Illumina, is based in San Diego. Just a thought.
So, I mean, I could offer an initial reaction to that, Ian. I wouldn't call it a distraction because it's sensibly focusing on one part of the process that's really important, that where we embed best practice across the UK, because we know that there's variability of practice, and obviously that's what Practice Oral in significant part is helping to address, to make sure there's a rising tide in terms of institutions' abilities to do this stuff really well. I mean, you allude to the downstream challenges that companies face when they've been created, when they're on that growth trajectory. And I mean, that speaks to big challenges in terms of access to capital, growth capital, the way that obviously pension funds in the UK invest in risk capital, the amount to which that can actually flow into our spin-out community. It speaks to challenges with talent, the pool of talent we have in the UK, which is frankly not as great as we have in California. So I think we've developed quite a good sense as a community over recent years as to where the impediments and barriers are from from Spinout inception through to building really large, successful, world-beating companies. I'm not sure they're all within the gift of this community to solve. I think we can give clear messages to government, to funders. I suspect we're pretty consistent in those, but I think let's make sure we're doing everything we can on the ground in our institutions to give these companies the best chance of success, and making sure that investors are looking at the UK environment as a really favourable place to invest in UK spinouts.
Just to add to that, we heard again from the Spinout review that the terms of reference for that are all about spinning out and how well we spin out, and it was made clear that the scale-up piece is owned at the Treasury by Jeremy Hunt. So he's not looking for the universities to solve the scaling issue at the moment.
I've got a question. I'm looking for hands, so just put up your hand if you've got a question. But about the internationally, do you think that the guide could be used internationally? And I know, Adam, you've got some example of possibly where it could be, and I think that, is it going to be useful, or is it too different a context?
Well, I mean, clearly the terms have to be viewed in the context that they're created in the UK environment. But that said, you're right. I mean, I've used it, shared it with a colleague based out of Germany who's involved in discussions with German investors and universities, really trying to answer the same question. What are appropriate terms for licensing, for new company creation in the German ecosystem, which is different, but actually many of the elements in the USIT guide, I think, are exportable in the same way that elements of the bulk guide are relevant and exportable to the UK. So, there's quite a big overlap in terms of the Venn diagram. So absolutely, it's something which we should be sharing as an example of what we think is market conditions in the UK, and others can maybe take some inspiration from.
And to add to that, I think most of the spin-outs and licenses that we do aren't always with UK investors or companies. So a lot of those licensing terms are based on things that we've put into agreements with US companies and companies from around the world. So I think it could be used globally. And I know we heard from one of our colleagues from Edinburgh that he's already had colleagues in Helsinki who, when he arrived, had it and said, how useful it was for them. So I think definitely it's international.
One of the items we did talk about, Leslie referred to this being a living document and what happens next with it. We did talk about, could we get an international standard together that brought together US Bolt and USIT, perhaps focused on a different area, not life sciences, could be climate, could be software. So that could be a next challenge.
And what do you think the differences would be? I mean, where are the specific life science bits that actually you would need to change, or is it just it's generally enough at the moment?
I think we picked life sciences because it's the most well characterised. So there's a very well understood deal structuring approach to life sciences that is not yet at the same level of maturity in, say, physical sciences. So that's why we homed in on life sciences. It's possibly the most complex of all of the commercialization deals that we do. To some extent, some of the other technologies can be a subset, but our thinking now is that should there be an addendum for software deals, an addendum for climate deals? That's potential directions of travel, but we're interested in where the needs are as well.
Thanks. I mean, I think it's interesting from the therapeutic side in terms of licensing, because it's such a regulated environment, and I think that's helped to inform. But I think that might be coming to things like AI, where there's a lot of talk about regulation and bringing that in. So there are, I think, opportunities for it to be applied outside of the life sciences. But I think it'd be really good to get input from this group, certainly, on which areas they find problematic. And which areas, and how we might structure that, because I think it could look quite different.
Question at the back.
Thank you. Nick McNaughton, Campus Plus. I'm okay. I'm okay. Nick McNaughton, Campus Plus. I'm here visiting from Australia and ran a venture fund focused on the Australian National University for the last 10 years. And I just wanted to point out to everybody the similarities between what's going on in the UK and what's going on in Australia. Here you're now outside an economic bloc. You're an island nation, and building alliances with new international partners, I think, is something that's important. You've just signed a free trade agreement with Australia. And I think that the similarities around what's going on in the Five Eyes markets, so Canada, North America, New Zealand, the UK and Australia are very similar. And this guide is really fantastic. Simon knows that I'm a great fan of it, and I'll be sharing it with all my colleagues in Australia. And so I think it's a congratulations to everybody involved in putting the work together.
Thank you. And I think just adding to the international perspective, we had Polish visitors yesterday, and I was thinking, you need this guide. I'm going to send it to all my colleagues in South Africa, because I think it's such a useful starting point, even if the system is different, even if the legal structures are slightly different, it's a really useful starting point. So it's good to see that the guide will be used across different contexts as well. I've got a question on the one thing I note, sorry? Oh, it's a question. Okay, carry on, and then I'll ask mine.
Okay, sorry. I will try and explain this, and I'm sorry if it is a naive question, but I'm trying to think about other elements, like, for example, insurance and reimbursement processes, which a company would think about when they want to settle themselves. And I would like to understand how early in the discussion these parameters are coming into play, and whether there are coming into play at all, and whether something like that could actually influence the negotiation if you actually put some other parties in this. For example, the type of insurance that can be applicable, the reimbursement model. Is that something you would like to comment about?
Sure. If I understand the question, you're talking about medical care providers in terms of insurers?
It can be any type of company. For example, it can be like a healthcare company or a biotech company.
I mean, actually, I think Rick might be able to answer that.
Or new medicine, like you've mentioned gene therapy, for example,
yeah.
or cell therapy, these type of new technologies.
So we have done a license with a company called BioMarin in the US for a gene therapy, and I don't know, Rick, did that come up in your discussions?
No, you wouldn't normally. It's up to the licensee at the end of the day to work with the regulators on reimbursement and and the payers, etc. That doesn't come into the negotiations when we're negotiating a license. Insurance-wise, of course, they have to indemnify us against anything. So, a company has to have proper insurance. A licensee has to have proper insurance, and that level of insurance may differ if you're in a preclinical phase. It needs to go higher at the clinical side. So if you're dealing with a small spin-out, they can't afford the super expensive insurance originally. So you let them pivot it in that way.
Perhaps I understood the question slightly differently. If it was around providing support to the startup company to enable them to structure themselves well, that's slightly out of scope of what USIT is for. And we certainly have business mentors, experts in residence that can help give that kind of guidance to founders. But that's not really the purpose of USIT, which is more around getting the deal negotiated around the formation and the engagement with investors.
Do you think there's a danger that people, because I think in the USIT guide it says, you aim for 3 months, but obviously there's a whole lot of stuff beforehand, and so the danger it possibly is that academics say, but I've come to you with an idea and 3 months later I haven't got a company. Is there a danger of that, do you think, with the USIT guide putting that sort of number in? Possibly,
but we know that getting the clock started is a key issue, and many times, particularly if it's a first-time academic founder, they might have IP that might have been influenced by 15 different research agreements, including 5 that we've never seen before. And so there's a whole process that has to start before even USIT kicks in terms of clarifying the IP package that will go into a company. And then it's rare that it's just us, the founder and the investor. There are quite often, particularly in life sciences, medical charities, entities like NIHR, Wellcome Trust, British Heart Foundation. They want their own slice of the pie, and they want to be consulted about that as part of the process. And I think when we talk about things like the government spin-out review, that is one area that has already been identified as perhaps an opportunity to save more time in the process by having more of a formulaic approach with some of our medical charities.
Yeah, hi. So, Anne, you mentioned that sometimes the bottleneck is the inexperience on the side of the investor. And yeah, I think that's probably true. But actually quite a lot, the partners that you spoke to as part of this all look like they're sort of fairly established. And I'm sort of wondering whether, I mean, USIT is obviously brilliant for universities, and I think that we will, sort of implement this on our side. But are there similar efforts within the VC community to push it out and establish it as the market normal, which I think is what we're all aiming for?
I think, so the BBCA have been very involved in this, so that should help, and we can direct investors back to the BBCA. I think actually having a hard copy document is really useful as well to be able to point to. You're always going to get some difficult investors, and I think one group I would usually refer to are angel investors, because they're individuals who may not have even heard about the USIT guide. So I think that's where it could become tricky. But again, having that hard copy document, I think, can be really useful. So there's still going to be challenges. I think there's still going to be challenges on both sides, but I think hopefully it's got a long way to try and address that. And given you, I don't want to say a weapon, but I can't think of a better word, but, to be able to fight your corner a bit more.
And I think, so hand in hand with angel investors, and indeed others sometimes, the big challenge can be where their legal counsel has no prior experience of supporting university spin-outs. Because if the angel's inexperienced, they're going to be looking to their lawyers to give them advice, which is what lawyers do. If that advice is completely out of market, as it can be sometimes, then this is, again, a good reference point to be able to present and say, look, this isn't just our view as a university. This is a combined consensus view of sophisticated investors and a group of prolific universities. So, you might want to think about changing your lawyer.
Just building on that point, we did have some law firms contribute to the document as well. So they are in the tent too.
Hi, this might be with quite a lot of overlap with a few questions back, and it's not something I have much information on. But with the advent of the Inflation Reduction Act and the conversations about reductions or negotiations in medicine pricing, what impacts could that have on spin-out business model and consequently on recommendations when negotiating?
Where to start on that one? I would hope it brings more funding into the scene. And I certainly have heard anecdotes from some of our US colleagues about more interest in climate technologies based off the Inflation Reduction Act on the hope that it's going to bring more funding into the ecosystem. I don't know whether cash has arrived yet in that regard.
Yeah, I confess I wasn't quite sure what the question was. I'm sorry.
Yeah, fair enough. Just to condense, yeah, it's a very large bit of legislation, and I was only focusing on a very small amount, which is, from what I've understood, the government might have more powers to negotiate on the price of medicines.
Oh, that baby. Yes. Yeah, I can't. I mean, that's a big bucket or thread to unpull, ravel, whatever. And your question is in relation to these guides. How is that going to impact that?
Yes.
Yeah, this is a drop in the ocean on that very, very political issue. I mean, I could start talking about how we are fighting hard to demonstrate that the Bayh-Dole Act is not intended to be a price control mechanism, to demonstrate that the Science Act and the Chips and Science Act and all of the mechanisms that they've got to try and ensure domestic manufacture is that we will build that into our licenses and try and ensure that more manufacturing is going on. But the infrastructure is needed, the technical infrastructure, equipment and people and all of those things. So there are many facets, but there's strong opposition to IRA being used as a mechanism by which to control prices or reduce prices.
I mean, I wouldn't pretend to be anywhere near expert in the Act, but I mean, potentially there are implications for different modalities of therapeutics and the relative attractiveness of small molecules versus biologics. I don't think that's going to filter through into undermining the relevance of the terms in the USIT guide, because they're presented as ranges in any case, and I think it's just depending on actually how that implementation pans out, it will just be another factor which is taken into account when looking at where in the range those financial terms should fall. So, yeah, I don't think it'll have any greater consequence than that.
And I think, to add one further point, I'm not necessarily sure it's the university's job to be getting into those sorts of fights, because I think that comes at pharma and government. I think it's at those levels that it probably would have a more effective approach. We're there to produce impact, and our researchers are doing blue skies research, and if they come up with something, a new way of treating a disease, then in my view, our role is to get that out there as soon as we can. I think it's a government industry type of discussion. We can have input, but I think that's a fight for them.
Thanks a lot.
Hi, Vince Robson, Northern University. You've referenced the adequacy of investor legal counsel. How much contribution have internal legal teams had into the development of the guide in your institution?
I can answer that from UCL's point of view, and Rick, tell me if I've got this wrong. We had a big involvement of our legal team. We've got quite a big legal team within the TTO, and I think we may also have talked to some of our external counsel as well to have input. So we had a lot of input on that.
Any of the other universities involved have any comment on their internal legal teams?
We do.
That's Cambridge.
Cambridge also had legal teams, internal legal teams involved. I think, is there a question at the back there? No, there, sorry. Carry on.
Hi, I'm Nick Gostick from Loughborough University. And thank you for the guide. It was very useful, and I spent most of my career batting off hearsay and rumour about what other more generous universities offer their academics. And it's usually members of TenU that are pointed at, and it's good to be able to say, no, this is the hard copy of what they do. But I just wondered to what extent you considered whether or not the TenU universities themselves were the outliers, and the rest of us are battling under very different conditions of not having internal legal teams. The large investment funds yet ready to invest in spinouts. Academics that are experienced of running spinouts and are doing it for the second and third time, and a pool of experienced spinout CEOs to bring in to run the company. And one consequence of that, I think, is possibly, and it is unfortunately the single largest take home from the guide, which is the university equity take. In that a lot of the guides I've seen, the academic founders equity take isn't the rest of the equity. And I think that's because the larger, more experienced universities very quickly start diluting the cap table with founders and professional management coming into the business and investors in a way that other universities don't. So that it looks like, and then the founder's expectation is to take more equity. The academic founder's expectation is to take more equity. than perhaps is usual at TenU universities, for example?
I can answer, I think, two of those. In terms of the founders' equity, I think that was what we were trying to do in the guide, was to show there were lots of levers and that it wasn't as straightforward as just looking at the equity right at the beginning. There were lots of things that influenced that. And I think the second thing is we have got an investment fund, that's true, but we have some of our biggest battles with the fund when we're actually doing deals. So it's not necessarily made it any easier for that. I don't know if it's...
Yeah, I mean, perhaps don't assume that we have all of the riches you've just described, because we don't, Imperial doesn't have a large investment fund, and we don't have a large number of academics that are on their second and third and fourth spin-out. And at the same time, we're trying to grow the community. So by the nature of that, we're working with first-time founders. We have done quite a bit to grow volunteer networks, and we've focused quite a lot of that on supporting our student entrepreneurs. So and they're working voluntarily. So that's not a function of the richness of the university. That's a function of trying to get out there and bring our alumni and friends in to support the ecosystem. We've consulted throughout, so via Praxis Oral and other mechanisms. So we have listened to the universities as best we can, and come up with what we felt is appropriate for the community overall.
Just following up on that question to Leslie, did you find in the US that smaller universities who maybe weren't involved or didn't spin out a lot of companies had reservations about the guide? Or did they think, oh, well, at least I've got a starting point now, I don't have to start from scratch because I don't have a legal team that can guide me?
So from what I can gather, there's been one vocal opponent to the boat guide, but the smaller universities, I mean, if you look on the Autumn website or our university website, it's a broad range of people who have also endorsed it. But to your point, I mean, I am always the first to put my hand up and say, please God, don't use MIT as a comparator of normal. And people don't invite me into meetings because I wear pink and have strange hair. They invite me in because I'm at MIT and they want to know what the secret sauce is. And it's taken 70 years and a lot more than tech transfer to build what is going on in Cambridge. So for MIT, Stanford and Columbia to be involved, I think what I'd say is the benefit of having, and I know we were not involved in the USIT guide, but the nugget, the kernel of catalysm came from Oren Herkowitz at Columbia and all of that work, is actually the ability to elevate and amplify through the platform of TenU and make people pay attention. Now, not everybody is going to agree with either Bolt or USIT, but you have more information and basis for argument, rationale, backbone, whatever it is that you need to demonstrate to your various respective leadership, community, regional, whatever, that you know what is good and reasonable practice, understanding the bounds of why it might be different in certain circumstances. And I'd say take advantage of those folks who happen to have, by nature of their brand, in the case of MIT and Stanford, I'll be the first to say we have not got it all right. And I don't think anyone at TenU is saying we are all better than and more perfect than you are. We've all got our warts and whatever else. But I think this has been a great opportunity to elevate a conversation to a level where people have paid attention to Simon's point that the Spinout review people went, if that guide had been here, and now if not for TenU, this would not have occurred. Not because anybody was lazy, but nobody has the time or resources or ability or the platform to actually put this together. And I think that's the benefit of it. But don't mistake that for, we're sitting all on a pedestal and judging everyone. This is kind of like a community effort.
Thank you. Adam?
Just as a further comment, I mean, I completely agree with everything that Leslie said, and there's fantastic practice in many institutions outside of those that have contributed to USIT Guide. But I think what it does really usefully for maybe smaller universities outside of the Golden Triangle or other hotspots is provide a really clear picture of what sophisticated investors will expect of any given university. And obviously what we'd love to see in the UK is more large, deep-pocketed, sophisticated investors putting their money across the nation, not just into Oxford, Cambridge, London. And I think this is one of the ways that the guide can catalyse that activity, because it can provide everybody with a clear picture of what those investors will expect and what we as a community need to put on the table to attract them to invest all over the country.
Yeah, I mean, I think having been at small and large universities, I think the key is clarity and transparency. And I think what the guide is doing is giving us that clarity and transparency without being too prescriptive. And I think to a large extent, our academics, particularly those in institutions where they haven't been done before, they just have no idea of what's possible, what's not possible. This is giving that landing point, as you say. Question at the front?
You talked briefly there about deep pockets across the whole of the UK, not just focused in the usual spaces. Do you think devolution is going to help with that? Do you think that's going to be a hindrance? Or do you think the ecosystem is quite indifferent to that, at least in the short term?
That's a good question. I don't think investors, particularly the really large, deep-pocketed investors, particularly care about devolution. They just care about good investment opportunities. They care about generating a return for their limited partners in the right kind of time frame. Where those opportunities come from, it can be as much a matter of practicality as anything. Can they get to board meetings easily? Can they do their scouting easily? It comes down to quite prosaic factors as that. And they know that, by and large, in the Golden Triangle, there's a greater density of opportunities. That isn't to say there aren't wonderful opportunities outside of that, but how do we provide the pull factors to get them to go a little bit further afield and recognise that there are many other opportunities in the UK. And if they have some sense that if they go to other institutions, they can have a really sensible conversation around terms within the kind of parameters in the USIT guide, that's just one way to lower the barrier of entry.
Sally Cudmore from University College Cork in Ireland. We've got a really good set of national templates, which I have to say we find really useful across the Irish ecosystem. But the one thing in particular that I find that the founders can quite often niggle with are the consent matters. And I'm just wondering, did you give any thought to the consent matters as part of this process, or was that just considered to be too prescriptive altogether? I suppose I mean it in the context that, for example, the founders, they're always asking, why is the university trying to control us to that level, for example? Yeah.
That's a hard question. I'll go first. I'll try and answer that. I think that there's not really a simple answer to it. I think each university is so different, and they've all got different levels of comfort and things that they're particularly scared of, and the consequences of that. And I think that's why we sort of left it alone, didn't we, really? We're not really prescriptive about it at all, because that was the one area that is really difficult and can be really inflammatory as well.
We can add it to the list of things to fix, I guess. So there are 23 parameters there. Maybe there's a room for a 24th one there. And I think there was a sense of let's get off the ground with as many things as we can. But
yeah, I certainly find it can really depend on the risk appetite of the university.
Yeah. Thank you.
So I've had many battles over consent rights with my old Oxford hat on. And I mean, as part of the process of changing Oxford's policy on equity, there was a consultation process I led with investors, both in Europe and the States, to get a sense as to which parts of Oxford's policy and practice might deter those investors from putting money into our companies. And consent rights was one of them. And I think, going back to my earlier comment, often our institutional approach or comfort risk appetite is absolutely informed by the very worst cases that we've all experienced, and the policy immediately goes to mitigate for the worst case. And I think universities and I include Oxford in this, can absolutely be guilty of trying to mitigate contractually for risks which are vanishingly small, which might be 1 in 100 spin-outs. In the same way that large pharma companies can be exactly the same in other areas. So, it's an area where I think it'd be a great one to develop further the work of the USIT group, because I absolutely agree it's one where there's often real antagonism between universities and investors, but often not enough pragmatism, in my view.
Thank you. We've got 10 minutes left, so unless there's any burning questions, what I'm going to do is ask each of the panelists to just sort of sum up where they see the guide going, their hopes for the future. And I think from the previous discussion we had, the one before this session was particularly around high potential spin-outs, the growth word. I think it needs to be more nuanced than that, and I think a lot of us around our table agreed it's not only about high growth spin-outs, but I think that is a buzzword. It's something we need to consider. How do you think the USIT guide can add to that conversation about really growing spin-outs, getting them out there as quickly as possible, and really focusing on how do we get high potential spin-outs out? And your thoughts about sort of the future of the guide and where we're going?
I mean, I think the first place I think it would be really helpful is to get researchers thinking in a more entrepreneurial way and about how they might be able to do a spin-out, and to maybe take the reticence from some academics about getting involved in the process. Some are really keen to do a spin-out and they just want to do a spin-out even if it's not the right thing to do. I'm sure we've all had experience of that. But equally, I think there are some really exciting academics in terms of the research that they're doing that would be fabulous to get involved in more spin-outs, or just at least be thinking in that way. And if the USIT guy can raise that bar, that would be great.
I agree, just a general raising of the bar, reducing of friction, making this whole process easier for everybody involved, and everybody will win from that. Because there is more potential to unlock in the UK ecosystem across the higher education institutions. And this, for me, is a brilliant step towards that. So I'd love to see it develop further. I mean, I can imagine, Simon's mentioned that, Imperial learned something from this process. So, I'm sure that each of those universities that's contributed to this has already benefited and enhanced how they're operating. And I'm sure the same is true for, my old place, Oxford. Equally for investors, and I count Evotech, looking at the guide, there are things that we will learn from it. So it can only improve the landscape, but I think continuing to invest in it, explore new areas, expand it, be a worthwhile endeavour.
I think Olga mentioned in the last session that Thomas ran around commercially aware founders. I think that was the term or something similar to that. So a better informed community. So conversations that are less adversarial, more based on evidence, referring back to the USIT guide. So that's what I hope. So we're changing the nature of those conversations. Everybody's better informed. The tone of the document was, we tried to make it as simple to understand as possible, recognizing that it is complex. Forming a high potential spin out is a complex operation, and there's a lot to take in and understand. But we tried to make the language and had examples so that it can be a learning document, and everybody can win from that.
So to have more high potential spin-outs, you need more spin-outs. There was a little discussion at our table about what do you mean by, I think you mentioned that. And Adam, you said raising the bar. I'm going to say lowering barriers to entry, particularly in areas of DEI. Providing this to communities and individuals who will not typically even enter the room because they are scared of not knowing, and giving them access to this. And as we know, the economic loss of not engaging with those communities is billions of dollars. And so I think this utilization of this in those areas is huge. Maybe that's one of the areas we can think about how to expand use into not only those areas, but social enterprise as well.
Thank you very much. Well, I'm hoping you found this session useful. Please take a guide or 3 on your way out and spread them widely in your institution, particularly to your top management. I think it's a fantastic piece of work. I wasn't involved in it, but it really is something that I wished we'd had a number of years ago. And certainly when some of the deals I've done, I think if I had the guide, it would have been a lot better, the deal. So please join me thanking the speakers, and we'll see you at the reception.